Yeah, something sure is happening here, and what it isn't, what it is ain't exactly clear. The Buffalo Springfield had that right 50 years ago, and it's still right today. And Retake Our Democracy in its blog, in its alert system for the legislature, in its radio show, and in its Zoominars tries to help you keep informed and make sure you know what's going on and what you can do about it. And so my name is Paul Gibson, and I'm the host of Retake Our Democracy. And just had to do something real quick, turn off my Bluetooth. And today I'm going to be speaking with Margaret Brown Vega and Nathan Craig. They're two members from People Over Private Prisons. And that's a grassroots coalition that is seeking to prohibit New Mexico from entering into new contracts or renewing existing contracts with private prisons. And this is one of Retake Our Democracy's priority bills. So we're very eager to share what they know about the bill and make sure you understand the bill too, so you can advocate for it. I also want to remind you that this radio show is on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station, and it airs at 8:30 a.m. every Saturday morning or streaming live. And I also wanted to mention that if you miss any of this conversation, you're driving around and you want to catch the rest of it, and also you can go to retakeourdemocracy.org, hover over the actions and events menu, and you'll see Retake Conversations, and all of our conversations going back 4 years, you'll find there. So, and finally, I want to acknowledge that we're conducting the interview on stolen Tewa land. And we want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such great shepherds of that land and for providing us with a model for how to form your relationship between yourself and the earth. And so thank you to them, and we're gracious that we're allowed to be residents of their land. So that's, before we get to our guests, though, I really want to talk just briefly about the coming legislative session and what Retake is doing. As many of you know, we have a 2021 15 legislative bills that we're advocating for in 2021. Those are our transformation bills. And we also have 28 priority bills. And all those bills are listed on our website at retakeourdemocracy.org over the legislation menu on our homepage. And if you hover over it, you can see where our Retake bills are listed. And you'll find that when you get there, there's going to be a nice, concise summary for each of the first 15 bills. And in almost all of them, then there's a link to a one-page summary, sometimes a two-page summary, that will have good speaking points for when you're talking to a legislator about a bill. You'll also find under that legislation menu how you can join one of our Senate district teams. And we're advocating at the legislature this year in a different way than we have in the past. We will still send out our legislative alerts to all 3,000 of you on our list. But we are also going to try and advocate early. And so we're organizing teams by Senate district because it's been our experience that our bills tend to die in the Senate as opposed to in the House. And maybe because of some of the election work a lot of us did, that will change this year because the Senate is a very different place. But nonetheless, we're organizing by Senate district, and we're having constituent senator Zoom conversations throughout the first 3 weeks of January. And we've had about 5 or 6 of those have been held already. They're extremely useful in identifying where legislators have gaps in their understanding of bills. And if we identify a senator who starts talking about why the Health Security Act costs too much money or why we can't afford to do early childhood funding, we find out what their thinking is, and then we go to the sponsors of the bill or the advocacy groups like POP, People Over Private Prisons, and they get in touch with the legislator and kind of go, well, wait, I understand you thought this, maybe would you consider thinking about it this way, and that kind of thing. So you can get on, sign up for those things on our website as well. I just have to briefly acknowledge that we're recording this on Thursday. Wednesday was a pretty crazy day. And I sincerely hope that all of you are keeping your hopes up. We did take the Senate, and that is the key thing. And so it was a little deflating to then go from winning the Senate and feeling all great about it, and then waking up to mayhem in Washington, D.C. But we'll get past that. So keep your hopes up. That's enough. Let's get started. Welcome, Margaret and Nathan.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank you. Good.
Okay. Well, I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. And so maybe we'll start with you, Margaret. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in a private prison reform or elimination.
Sure. So my name's Margaret Brown Vega. Actually live in Las Cruces, so based in the southern part of the state. And a lot of the work I do is as a coordinator for a volunteer organization called Advocate Visitors with Immigrants in Detention, or AVID. I'm also an anthropologist by training, so I kind of bring a lot of that perspective to the work that I do. But along with others in the state for the last couple of years, we've been trying to address this issue of private detention in one form, specifically through legislation in New Mexico. And so AVID, this organization, is one of the founding members of People Over Private Prisons, New Mexico, which I can talk a little bit more about in a bit, but I'll go ahead and let Nathan introduce himself.
Okay, Nathan, you're up.
I'm Nathan Craig. I'm also from Las Cruces. I'm also a co-coordinator of AVID along with Margaret, and I teach anthropology at New Mexico State University. I got involved in this issue through AVID by visiting people who were held in a private incarceration facility and hearing their experiences, seeing what the facility was about, thinking more about the issue and the problem. Being connected with the folks who are experiencing it really is a principal compelling reason why we began to get involved in this work.
Okay. So both of you came from AVID. Can you tell us just a little bit about the organization, People Over Private Prisons, and how it came about? And either one of you, Margaret, if you want to start, Nathan.
Sure. So I mentioned for the past couple of years, we've been working kind of in a loose coalition with several other organizations in the state to try and address this issue of private detention in one form. And in getting together in preparation for this year's legislative session, we kind of took a broader approach and really decided to formalize, that loose coalition into what is now People Over Private Prisons New Mexico. So since about June, members of our group, AVID, but also the ACLU of New Mexico, the Center for Civic Policy, Detention Watch Network, El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, New Mexico Cafe, New Mexico Dream Team, New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, Santa Fe Dreamers Project, and the Santa Fe Faith Network for Immigrant Justice, and along with some other individuals who aren't really affiliated with groups, came together and began working hard on this particular piece, again, on purely volunteer basis. So a lot of hard work by a lot of people giving energy to this effort, doing research, engagement, strategizing, really preparing this piece of legislation to be introduced this year. Most recently, AFSCME joined our coalition, and I think everyone is aware that they have a long history of being against privatization in incarceration. So I think we really align nicely on that point. So basically, we're a pretty diverse group, I think, of organizations and individuals, and we've come together specifically to see if we can end private incarceration and detention in New Mexico, right? And we see this as part of a broader effort to contribute one piece to ending mass incarceration and overcriminalization of people.
Okay. Nathan, did you have anything to add? Or are you guys going to tag team off and answer different questions? What we don't want is where both of you are sitting there being polite and waiting for the other person to talk. That makes bad radio. So to provide
That's not our,
what? Go ahead.
that's not our relationship. So
okay, so just to provide some historic context, can you just tell us a little bit about how private prisons came into being in the first place in the US and in New Mexico?
sure. There's quite a bit to that story, but to boil down to some of the key parts, there's actually a really interesting direct line between slavery and private prisons. And let's take Don T. Hutto as an example. In the 1960s, Hutto managed the Ramsey Prison Farm in South Texas. This facility held mostly Black inmates where they grew cotton. The prison farm that Hutto managed was a former slave plantation, and Hutto lived on the plantation. Images from the facility show large numbers of Black men hoeing the ground under the stern eye of a corrections officer mounted on a horse, toting a shotgun. I think you get the picture, right? So years later, in 1983, Don T. Hutto, who ran that facility, went on to co-found the first dedicated private prison company, CoreCivic. He and his co-founder planned to run it under a model of privatized hospitals. And we know how great that's been for the country, right?
Right.
Well, the following year, in 1984, Hutto became the president of the American Correctional Association. That same year, privately run jails became legal in New Mexico due in large part to heavy lobbying by a guy named O. Wesley Box, a Colorado oil and cattle magnate. Box admitted to lobbying for privatized incarceration because he saw an increase in county incarceration and an opportunity to make money on it. That set the stage that made private incarceration legal in the state and is part of what we're seeking now to undo. In 1989, CoreCivic, the firm co-founded by Hutto, took over New Mexico Women's Correctional Facility, repurposing it to the Northwest New Mexico Correctional Center. That's the state's first private prison. In the 90s, private prisons expanded under Gary Johnson, who ran on prison privatization and a commitment that hold convicts to serve longer sentences. Johnson took money from the private prison companies in his campaign and promoted the use of private prisons under the banner of neoliberal free market solutions, arguing that market competitiveness would bring cost savings of 30%, and prisons would be tools for rural development. Privatization continued to expand under Richardson with a similar logic, and that brings us more or less to where we are.
And what was the rural economic benefit that was promised?
Well, the idea is that hosting these facilities would bring jobs, that it would provide work for people in the communities who would serve as corrections officers, who would help to clean the facilities, do laundry, things like that.
Okay, well, and we're going to be talking a bit about that later. So let's start by laying out the scope of private prisons in New Mexico. Where are they located? How many are there? How many do they incarcerate? And to what degree does New Mexico have a larger proportion of private prisons than maybe in other states?
I'll go ahead and address those questions. And I think I'll start with the second one, right? Which is, New Mexico leads the nation in terms of its dependence on private prison contractors to operate and manage facilities. If you calculate the total number of beds, the capacity of each facility in New Mexico, 60% of those are actually in privately run facilities. So the state actually has 15 prison or detention facilities. Right. 7 of those are privately run. I think the total number of incarceration beds in New Mexico is over 12,000, and more than 7,000 of those are in private facilities. So the vast majority, right? And private facilities tend to be more full. Those contractors do a lot of work to make sure that their facilities are more full. They also hold people that are at lower custody status, so it tends to make them more full. So as recently as 2018, I think the Sentencing Project is reporting that 53% of the total incarcerated population in New Mexico is in private facilities. So no matter how you look at it, I mean, it's a very high number. And given that the US as a nation is very dependent on, on incarceration and private incarceration, and that New Mexico leads the nation in that kind of puts us in a very unique position that I think many of us don't want to be in. It's the dependency on private prison contractors to manage and run these facilities is very strong here in New Mexico. So right now there are 7 privately run facilities. As recent as 2019, there was an additional one, but that actually changed the contractor. In that case, it was Geo Group, pulled out of the contract very quickly, giving the state very short notice, and the state had to assume management of that facility. So right now we have 7 facilities in the state that are privately run. If we look at kind of the counties that are most dependent on these facilities, and the top one is really Otero County. So there's 2 facilities that are in Otero County. The Otero County Prison Facility, which holds people in state corrections custody, also county custody, but also has people in federal custody, particularly U.S. Marshals. And then adjacent to that is the Otero County Processing Center, which is a dedicated ICE facility. Both of those are actually managed by Management and Training Corporation, which is a private prison contractor. And those are the 2 facilities that they operate in the state. Capacity of the prison facility is about 1,420 people, and the ICE facility next door is just over 1,000. So it's nearly 1,500 people that can be detained or incarcerated in Otero County. Cibola County is the county that holds the second highest number of people, has the second highest number of private prison beds in the state of New Mexico. And the 2 facilities that are in Cibola County are both managed, they actually owned and managed by CoreCivic. So that's the Northwestern New Mexico Correctional Center, which is the one that Nathan referred to, which the building itself was the first private prison in New Mexico. It's now called something else than when it originally was. They have a capacity of about over 800, and they hold people in a Department of Corrections custody. CoreCivic also operates the Cibola County Correctional Facility, which is in Milan. So the Northwestern facility is in Grants and the other one's in Milan. They're pretty close to each other. That's a larger facility that has capacity of over 1,100 spaces in there. And that facility primarily holds people in federal custody. So that's U.S. Marshals custody, but also people in ICE custody. CoreCivic also operates a facility in Torrance County, the Torrance County Detention Facility, which is an estancia, which reopened actually not too long ago. It has a capacity of about 910. They hold people in county, ICE, and U.S. Marshals custody. And so between those 3 facilities in Cibola County and then the one in Torrance, which are all owned and managed by CoreCivic, CoreCivic actually operates the most number of private prison beds in the state of New Mexico. And then we have the Geo Group. They have 2 facilities that they own and manage as well. And that's the Guadalupe County Detention Facility in Santa Rosa. That has a capacity of about 610. And then there's the much larger Lea County Detention Facility, which is in Hobbs, and that has a capacity of over 1,200. And both of those are prisons that hold people in Department of Corrections custody. So there's really a patchwork of these facilities in New Mexico.
Well, I got to take a brief break to remind our listeners that it is in times like these, pandemic, isolation at home, no movies to go to. It's at times like this that KSFR is so important. And so we want to emphasize that while the hosts of most of the radio shows are all volunteers, that there are expenses that need to be met. And so if you have a spare $10, $20, you can go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button on the homepage and make a contribution, and just look at it as your ticket for admission to some really good programming. And I know they'd appreciate it. So we're talking with Margaret Brown Vega and Nathan Craig, and they're members of the People Over Private Prisons organizations that is advancing legislation in 2021. And we're going to wind up talking about that in just a minute. But first, why am I not surprised that the development of private prisons is part of a larger agenda to privatize any government process that can be profitable to a corporation? Can you lay out some of the negative consequences that are a result of a privately owned prison as opposed to a governmentally owned?
Sure, Paul. I'm gonna start with what I think is a really big one here. So let's begin with the fact that private prison companies get paid per filled bed space. That's how they make money. Hutto even described it as a kind of hotel where people check in for a decade. Okay,
You
in a
really
free
did?
yes, in a free society, when the government deprives an individual of their liberty, that's a really solemn decision. By introducing profit-driven entities into this solemn civic equation, it results in a situation where there's an incentive to incarcerate more people and hold them longer. Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. The corrections industrial complex is a similar arrangement that significantly contributes to mass incarceration. The US incarcerates a far larger portion of its population than any other country in the world. New Mexico, which relies so heavily on privatized incarceration, jails a larger portion of its population than the nation as a whole. And a lot of this is driven by this perverse arrangement of having business entities that make their money by incarcerating people. They're looking to grow their business, and they do this by filling incarcerated bed spaces. So for me, probably the biggest negative consequence of prison privatization is its contribution to mass incarceration.
Okay, well, it certainly is. How does the profit incentive drive the conditions in these prisons? And how does this contribute to inmates experiencing prolonged incarceration and failure to prepare inmates for their eventual reunification with family, emancipation into the communities?
So there are a number of ways that this works. First, prison companies and organizations they belong to, like the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, draft and lobby legislation like mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, three strikes or outlaws, laws that put more people in prison and keep them there longer. It's a profitable arrangement for the prison companies. The companies also contribute to candidates that back privatization and adopt tough on crime stances. Once the prison companies have people in their grasp, then they run the facilities to minimize operating costs, basic capitalist decision-making processes with an economy of scale. One of the key ways that prison companies cut costs is by understaffing. The DOJ found widespread understaffing in private prisons, and it's a chronic issue in New Mexico. By understaffing, there are fewer guards to inmates. Because it's cheaper, the companies prefer to replace workers with cameras. People are also expected to work longer hours and for less pay than in public facilities. Those long hours and understaffing create dangerous conditions for everyone involved, both incarcerated people and staff. DOJ found levels of violence much higher in private facilities than public ones. It's bad for everyone and it doesn't save money. Another means of cost cutting is to skimp on rehabilitation programs.
Right.
Now, many companies like those in New Mexico tout their programming, but this is more of advertising than meaningful treatment. Multiple studies show that recidivism rates are higher for people in private facilities than in public ones, and much of that's related to the higher levels of violence in private facilities.
Wow, that's kind of bleak picture. We have an ICE facility. I heard Margaret mention that is privatized. How badly are the immigrants in this facility treated? I'm almost afraid to ask.
No, I mean, this is a good question. So there is one dedicated ICE facility in the state of New Mexico. That's the Otero County Processing Center. In fact, it was built to hold specifically people in ICE custody, which is supposed to be civil detention, right? But there are also immigrants that are held in U.S. Marshals custody, for example, in other facilities. So again, this sort of patchwork of things to me is really important to underscore, because I think the kind of custody that people are in is important, right? But we sort of see a common denominator with privately run facilities across the board, which is it relates to this cost cutting, to not offering services, not having adequate suitable conditions inside, even things like not having like suitable food to eat. Those problems exist in a lot of carceral facilities, but they are particularly acute in privately run facilities because it costs more money to really take care of people. And if that's eating into your profit, that's one of the places that you're going to shave off some of your costs, right? The other thing I think Nathan mentioned relates to staffing. So just like in prison facilities, in the ICE facility, we also see understaffing, which is particularly acute, and that's not good for everyone, for anyone rather. So, you know, the Otero County Processing Center, the Torrance County Detention Facility, Cibola County Correctional Center, all of those hold people in ICE custody, and in all of them, there have been people who've died in custody. There's been medical neglect. During the pandemic, what we've seen is like no protections or very few protections afforded to people. When people protest their conditions, they're met with, you know, use of force and like pepper spray. There's labor exploitation, just like you see in prisons. As Nathan mentioned earlier, people work for $1 a day, doing laundry, cutting hair, you know, pretty much maintaining the facility. All of that, again, is to like cut costs. And that's one of the things that makes, I think, those contracts in particular so lucrative, if you will, particularly for the companies. Yeah. In some ways, I think people that are held in ICE custody in private facilities have fewer protections. The state cannot really intervene. We saw this, for example, with the Otero County Processing Center and the outbreaks that were early on in the pandemic that occurred there and at the prison facility. The Department of Health had a really hard time getting into the facility to sort of encourage people to test. It just wasn't happening at all. So I think when you add private contractors into the mix, what you end up in a situation is various entities pointing fingers at each other, and everyone escapes culpability, right? There's really very little accountability. There's very little transparency. And so in particular, the private prison contractors end up operating with total impunity. And I think that's something that we see again acutely in private facilities, not just I think in the ICE facility. I do want to mention that that AVID, in collaboration with Innovation Law Lab, we did just release a report about conditions and the experiences of people in the Otero County Processing Center called Process by Torment. So people can kind of keep their eyes open for that report. That details a lot of what goes on in that particular facility, which is
that's available on
unusual.
your website. That's available on your website, or?
Yeah, people can actually find it and download it at avid at chihuahuan.org.
Okay. We've got about another minute. Maybe we can get started on this next question. And I want our listeners to know that we will continue this discussion, and you can go to retakeourdemocracy.org, hover over the actions and events page menu, and you'll see Retake Conversations, and I'll post that probably 8:30 or 9 in the morning on Saturday, so you'll be able to hear the full interview. And you just gave us your website address. Do you want to give that again and maybe tell them any other information that they can get there? And you're gonna want to listen to the rest of the show, folks, because we're going to talk about the bill they're advancing, and it's one of our priority bills.
Yeah, so our organizational website is avid chihuahuan.org. And I will mention that the People Over Private Prisons Coalition has a website as well, and that's just popnm.org, poppnm.org.
And could you give the AVID one again?
Yeah, avid Chihuahuan, as in Chihuahuan Desert, .org.
Could you spell Chihuahuan?
CHIHUAHUAN.org.
Okay. And I want to thank you for being with us today. We're going to again resume the conversation in just a second, but I do want to thank our listeners for being with us today. We'll be back next week. I believe I'm going to be talking to someone from Catalyst Cooperatives, someone who is organizing worker-owned cooperatives throughout the state of New Mexico. They're just launching this. They're working with the Democracy Collaborative, which is a tremendous organization located in Cleveland and Washington, D.C. So listen up next week and stay healthy and stay hopeful. But most importantly, stay active. It's the only way we change this mess. So thank you. Bye-bye. All right, we're back by miracle of podcast, and I can turn off my timer. And, you know, I've seen that some state, and let me just remind our listeners that we're talking to Margaret Vega Brown and to Nathan Craig, and they are members of prisoners, private prison, people over private prison. I cannot get that right. People over private prison, and it's good that's not on the radio show. So I've seen that some people assert that the private prisons are really important to the local economies. They're a source of revenue, they're a source of jobs. And since they're mostly located in some of our poorer rural communities, it's the pushback from some legislators and leadership in those communities is we need these things. Can you respond to that assertion?
Sure. First, a lot of the work that's done in private prisons is severely underpaid prison labor, whether that's cleaning, laundry, food prep. People are getting paid pennies on the dollar to do the work that members of the local community should be doing. But let's look, for example, at an ICE facility, right? So one of the purported purposes of harsh immigration enforcement is to protect the wages of American workers, right? Well, in New Mexico's private ICE facilities, detained migrants are paid $1 a day to do work that people should be paid at least a minimum wage to perform. That's not protecting the American worker. It's protecting the bottom line of the private firms that are paid $90 a day to detain people. Let's talk about the community members who do work in the facilities. And let's look at the community with the county with the largest number of private prison beds and one of the poorest counties in the state, Otero, right? As Margaret described, there's 2 private incarceration facilities in the county. They're both located in Chaparral, which is the state's largest colonia. One facility is an ICE detention center, the other one's a prison. Now, one might think this is going to bring lots of jobs to rural New Mexicans. However, Otero is located right near the Texas border. Visit the 2 facilities on any day of the week, and what you'll find in the employee parking area is a lot full of cars with Texas license plates. MTC, the private prison company that runs the facility, mostly hires workers from El Paso who commute to the facility. Situations like that are true for most other private facilities across the state and actually across the nation. It is a very common pattern with rural prison hosting that most of the workers commute in from the nearest metro area. They commute long distances, often longer distances than most workers commute. They're coming in from the metro area. So very, very few of the jobs that are in these facilities are actually going to rural communities where the prisons are located. Now, I've compared unemployment rates between New Mexico counties that house prisons and those that don't. Prisons don't produce significant measurable positive impacts on unemployment rates. If you look at a county that hosts a prison, a rural county that hosts a prison, and all the adjacent other rural counties, and you look at their unemployment rates over time, and you mark when the prison's established, there's not measurable positive outcomes. In fact, in a number of cases, rural prison hosting counties actually have significantly higher unemployment rates than their non-prison hosting neighbors. In addition, many counties like Otero have actually gone into tens of millions of dollars of debt to build private facilities that primarily earn money for companies that are located out of state. It is a massive risk with very little reward.
That's sounds like a good reason to maybe draft some legislation that would prohibit the state from renewing those contracts or entering into them in the first place. I'm guessing that's what your bill, I believe it's got a number now, HB 40.
You are correct. We have a number now. So the bill is sponsored by Representative Angelica Rubio. The bill's number is HB 40, and it's entitled the Private Detention Facilities Moratorium Act. And Senator Ortiz-Pino he's agreed to work to shepherd the bill through the Senate. So the bill is an outright ban on the business practice of private incarceration. It prevents new contracts or the renewal of or expansion of existing contracts, and bars financial incentives for doing business with private contractors. The existing contracts are allowed to expire, but then they can't be renewed.
Right. So what are you hearing from legislators? I mean, it sounds like a great concept, but I find in working at the legislature, so many, common sense bills where you would just go, oh yeah, we got to do that. And then you run into problems. So what is the possible resistance you face? And what do you think of your chances of getting this through?
Sure, I'll tackle that one. I mean, it's interesting because we're hearing that there's actually broad support both in the Senate and the House, particularly in the House, and in particularly among Democrats, for this legislation. And this is not new, right? People have expressed support for a measure of this kind for a couple of years now, at least. But some legislators are expressing concerns again about the economic aspects, the sort of the myth of the jobs, as we call it, just continues to be accepted, right? That these are rural development tools. And so those concerns, I think, are what hold people up, even though they recognize these contractors are a problem. Right, the facilities that they manage and run are problems. They contribute to other problems in our state. It's long been recognized, but the reluctance has been sort of hinging on these sort of economic or financial impacts. So what we've done is just a lot of research, right, to, again, like what Nathan was discussing earlier, to counter some of these things, really these sort of unquestioned assumptions about what it is that these businesses actually do for our communities and for our state. And so I think that's where we've really focused a lot of our efforts on that. But despite that, I think there's still broad support. A lot of what we've done is just remind legislators that they have a lot of this information at hand already from things like the Legislative Finance Committee, right? As early as 2007, sort of like really pointing to the need to get away from privatization and incarceration. And so I think what we're hearing is that there's a lot of support, right? But just perhaps uncertainty. And I think that about how it would happen. And I think that speaks to how entrenched the whole thing is here in New Mexico. But I think it now seems like the time to really do something about it, because we certainly can't continue down this road. That doesn't really make sense for the counties that are losing out, for the communities that are losing out, and really for the state that's losing out. It's costing a lot more to do this thing that's really not beneficial, substandard, just, buying a service that isn't really worth what it's touted to be.
And so let me just ask you this about the math on this. If they pay less and have smaller staff and don't spend money on, good food or rehabilitation and things like that, how is it that they don't come in cheaper? I'm guessing it's huge profits.
So, whether it's Greg Zoli or Damon Heiniger, both of them make $5 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking a lot of that money is flowing uphill. One of the things that, if you look at the numbers from the Legislative Finance Committee and you compare the annual cost to detain a person for a year, whether it's at a private facility or a public facility, when to make the comparison, you actually have to look at the custody level of the individual. So private facilities only house medium and low custody individuals, whereas the state tends to house people at higher custody levels, which is more expensive.
Right.
But if you compare common custody levels between public and private facilities, the private facilities actually cost more. And if you calculate how many individuals are being held in those facilities, it comes out to about $26 million a year more that the state pays to house people in private facilities.
Wow. And I guess the other argument you might have is a counter argument to these counties that are worried about employment. It's not as if you're eliminating prisons. there's going to be a prison there, presumably, and it would be managed by the state or the county, and would hire maybe local people, only paying them better and not profiteering on the whole enterprise. Is that not accurate?
Well, you basically described what's already happened at Clayton. So that was a geo-run facility. They were not able to meet their contractual obligations in terms of staffing levels. They couldn't keep people hired at the facility, and they decided to pull out, and they did it very, very abruptly, which was really tough on the community. And the state took the facility over, and they're now public workers who are working at the facility who are going to have retirement plans and health benefits much better than they would have had at the private facility. And my understanding is that they have not had the same kind of staffing level problems that they had when it was managed by a private firm.
Imagine it's easier to recruit people if you pay them better and give them benefits and have them work under good conditions. That makes sense.
Well, I really want to thank both of you for being with us today. This is a bill we're going to push very hard. And we have already written, I basically stole everything you wrote on your 2-page info sheet and posted it as a blog. But we had several comments on it, and we've had people in our legislative action network comment on how important this is just to them. So I'm quite sure we'll be pushing legislators quite hard on this, and I really hope we get this done. It seems like the logical first step to really transforming the criminal justice system, because you know what you've described in terms of warehousing people and 3 strikes you're out, and keeping people using punishment rather than rehabilitation, that's endemic to government-owned prisons as well. And so hopefully we can take this to the next step, next legislative session, with some bills to transform those prison facilities. But thank you very much for being with us. And if you could tell our listeners again where they can get information about your organization and the bill, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so the best thing that people can do is go to our coalition website, which is popnm.org, poppnm.org. We have some of our research posted there, resources. The draft bill is there, so people can also take a look at that. People can also sign up for either regular updates, email updates, or if they want to be more involved in advocacy, they can also let us know. And that's the best way for us to be able to be in contact with folks. I also want to mention that we will have representatives from PopNM at this weekend's Legislative Action Expo, which is going to be a virtual event.
Yeah.
So we'll be there doing a presentation and have people on hand to answer questions that people may have.
I'm so glad you said that, because we have a room in that expo as well, and I haven't even written about it in the blog. So I've got to get that out there to attend that. And thank you both, Margaret and Nathan, and good luck with this bill. And hopefully by March 20th, we'll have this thing on the governor's desk. And
yes, we hope so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you too, both very much. Bye-bye.